Hari Om. Last week we touched upon some topics that hedged around the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of Sri Krishna, the purpose of why great beings and avatars like Mahavatar Babaji come and remain with us. And it's very interesting because prior to this talk and our meditation, we chanted the Mula Mantra, the sacred Mula Mantra, where we're invoking both the Bhagavati, the divine aspect of the Mother Goddess, and Bhagavate, the father aspect or the masculine aspect of God, and also the Purushottama. And then we're saying Hari Om Tat Sat, Hari Om Tat Sat, Hari Om Tat Sat. But of all the meanings that can be conveyed with what the Divine Mother means and how her manifestation affects us, how the more masculine aspect or the father aspect of God affect us, probably the most important thing is to understand what the word Hari means. Because really the word Hari, the name of God, has a specific connotation that is really important for us. And what it means is, many of the saints of India have said that God literally manifests in the most physical way within this entire creation as a dhoti or as a sari encircles the Divine Mother. She cloaks herself in a cloth. Hari is that divine aspect of the manifested Saguna or God with attributes that literally clothes himself in the entire universe. And so there we find ourselves literally in a universe, in a manifestation where we're surrounded by divinity. And then the idea is to reach perfection in this creation. And as we spoke last week, and Dan mentioned, well, then there's the problem of evil. And we started talking, what is evil? If we're in literally a creation that's literally a manifestation of divinity, why is there evil? And the teaching of the Buddha exclusively talking about suffering and the alleviation of suffering. One of the things that we touched upon, which is pivotal to the teaching of the Buddha, although many times he was asked about this divine aspect of creation, and he was asked about the self. Is there literally a divine aspect of the self which carries on from one incarnation to the next, which is imperishable, even though it is in a sense encased in a body, the divine Atman or the Param Brahma, which we've chanted? And the Buddha just never talked about the answer. He just left it. In fact, the same thing we find with Sri Ramana Maharshi, that great saint from southern India. There were times when he would literally say, the business of sadhana, the business of why we're gathered together, why we're coming together in God's name, he said, to reach that understanding and the perception of that perfection. So he literally would say, leave God out of it. And the reason is, and he would say, like the Buddha said, there is suffering, there is sorrow in the world, and how is it possible that we are divine incarnations, in a sense, manifested that, but we don't live that way? And how come there is this Hari who literally manifests in a form and brings to us, yes, times of joy, but also times of great sorrow and suffering? What's the purpose? And then we find beings such as the great Padre Pio, whom we all probably know, that great Capuchin monk, who carried in his body the stigmata of Jesus. He literally had the wounds of the 5 wounds of Jesus. And then at the same time, you'll find a physical manifestation of God like Mahavatar Babaji, who is deathless, incarnated in the world to alleviate the suffering of mankind. So we have kind of an enigma. We don't understand why beings like Ramana Maharshi will say, suffering is the way to the realization of God. And sorrow is, as the Buddha said, a fact, being the first noble truth. Suffering is, there is suffering. But the purpose of it is to comprehend it in ourself and to comprehend why we suffer. Because there's a divine mystical transformation that occurs in us when we comprehend the source of suffering and why we suffer. Why, as humans, we go from joy to sorrow and joy to sorrow, seemingly as it's in a sense, in India they'll say the play or the Maya, the sport of the Divine Mother, to bring this to us. And so what I wanted to do is read a little from one example of how a young lady, her name was Etty Hillesum, how she met the suffering during the Nazi occupation in World War II. This young girl was in her 20s, and she was in Amsterdam, and the Nazis and the Germans were routinely just evacuating all of those of the Jewish faith and taking them eastward toward concentration camps, and the majority of them, of course, suffered and died there. But her diaries, which she left, show an interesting idea of the suffering, how she saw the significance of it. So I wanted to read one little aspect of it. So she said, "We must be able to bear our sorrow. Even if it seems to crush us, we must be able to stand up again, for human beings are strong. And the sorrow must become an integral part of ourselves. We mustn't run away from it. We must bear it like an adult, not to relieve our feelings through hatred or feeling that it's unjust, but to see a mystical connotation about this." She also studied, no doubt, the teachings of the great Baal Shem Tov, who said there's a spiritual significance to everything that happens to us. Of course, it's easy to see the spiritual significance if we're having times of great elation and joy. We meditate, we have all sorts of beautiful surroundings and feelings of elation. But then when sorrow comes to us, to see the spiritual significance of that. So this young girl, she had just a tremendous love of beauty. And the way that her diaries elate and relate to us, how she saw beauty in everything. And then, of course, this great darkness came and all the beauty was taken away. But she still saw the beauty in the darkness. So she turned her suffering to joy. And so now we're starting to see how it's possible that there's a divine motive behind this world of conflict. This is exactly what the Mula Mantra is trying to convey to us, that there is the Shiva aspect who's sitting in renunciation, in a sense, completely at calm. And then there's the Divine Mother, the Bhagavati, who's causing all of this creation to roll forth with the dual aspect of sorrow and happiness. And the Purushottama, that fullness or that steadiness and complete wisdom which stands in the middle of the two. It's a really incredible picture. So Etty goes on to say, "We should give our sorrow all the space and shelter that it is due in our hearts." It's a really interesting idea, that we should allow the sorrow to enter into our heart and give it shelter. For if everyone bears honestly and courageously the sorrow that fills the world, it will abate. But if you do not clear a decent shelter for your sorrow and instead reserve most of the space inside you for thoughts of revenge or thoughts of anger, that which is born from sorrow will never come to fruition. And then she says, sorrow will never cease in this world. We should give sorrow all the space and shelter that it is due. There is no other alternative. If it is not owned and embraced, then it will destroy us. It will become a distorting, in a sense, demonic power, and from that the world will not move 1 inch forward out of the mire.